Hello everyone, today we deal with introductively a topic that we already discussed here and there in the videos about late medieval and early modern warfare. That is essentially the knowledge transfer from ancient military treatises to the ones of the aforementioned eras, and the say modest impact that this really had in the art of war of the same. Meaning what, to make the long story short? Well, that there have been scholars who built their sort of curriculum, their bibliography, on the idea, the belief that Renaissance warfare would have practically and concretely been modeled on Greco-Roman military manuals. This is an incredibly controversial topic, and this video is actually designed, given that I'm not an expert on the topic myself, but to still debunk from the perspective of actually a late medieval warfare expert, like I am, at least for the first half of the 14th century. And a problem, in fact, that I found also in my research, as far as some scholars, in fact, were simply saying, well, let's look at this battle, this formation, or whatever, the few that we know about that, even if we don't even know how the battle was fought, and let's try to imagine whether the author of this, whichever source was narrating that, then okay, in that article that I'm thinking about, actually there was a specific reason, because it was a prince whose library we actually know, and that did contain Vegetius for that matter. And let's try to see whether, in fact, Vegetius' work in that case would match with some, information contained in the work, in the details that this guy provides in explaining this battle, right? And the concept in itself is not stupid, right? You of course wanna know it, especially knowing that these commanders did read Vegetius. That was basically the only source from the ancient era that was really read in a military sense, and surely with some ambition of application. In fact, that would have, of course, influenced the same, but would have provided with that information, given that it was highly sought after. Like, medievals were quite aware of their past, right? This is what I try to explain through transverse ways on Schwerpunkt, even though, again, I don't deal with literature professionally. I mostly look at the battlefield, and so literature just as far as the battlefield is concerned. But that is, providing with sort of curtain, right, of wishful thinking when you do not look at the battlefield. And this is actually the main problem. I mean, I am pretty open to the idea that commanders, again, would have been influenced by ancient manuals a millennium after they were written, to the point of even making them think, okay, the Greeks, the Romans fought like this. Of course, the classical past was obsessively, looked at, and this is, again, that's what I was trying to finish before, aside from my digressions, really a constant throughout the entire Middle Ages. This was not something just of the Renaissance or the later Middle Ages. Throughout the entire Middle Ages, all civilized peoples looked exclusively back at the classical past, right? They had some folklore on their own, they had their own national contribution, whatever, but for the reasons that I think are clear by now, if you have listened at least to my History of Religion videos, everybody was aware of what had happened regarding the unity of the Catholic Empire, of the God-given imperium, and of course trying to emulate that, and trying to represent the same, which was actually believed to be going back towards the golden era, the age of gods, and so on. And if you are lucky enough to have had an extensive travel experience in Europe, you should have at least visually clear, if not rationalized yet, that of course the entire system until the fourth estate revolution, or also the third estate revolution, say until the 18th, the 19th, and 20th century, was exclusively based on pure classical tradition. Right? If you visit Versailles, if you visit basically all the all what the establishment of modern and part of contemporary Europe were about, and including the Middle Ages, that were obsessed with Alexander, with Caesar, etc., you will have not just Charlemagne and the great heroes and paladins that were part also of the medieval tradition, but still in that ancestral, primitive, unitary belief regarding how the imperium proceeded from God right through to earth through humans, through commanders. You realize that the sole purpose of these guys was coming to back to divine power itself, and the entire reference is exclusively designed after that. Right? So it's obvious that, and this is particularly evident during the Renaissance, that whenever every sort of classical style was imitated or looked after, sort of re-elaborated, which is a better definition, because the Renaissance is not happening as a mere copy of the past. Right? The myth that humanism of the Renaissance happened because some guy from Constantinople or from the Islamic world brought a couple of manuscripts and magically the West emerged from the Middle Ages is just what, again, fourth estaters without first world primary education can believe, without proper parenting and upbringing, right? The dark vision of the Middle Ages is being designed exclusively in an anti-traditional way when the fourth estate took power a few hundred years ago. Before that, nobody, of course, believed that the Middle Ages was what is being defined. Not even the humanists, right? Not even those who were looking at that and, of course, observing that there had been a decay from the past and called this era Gothic, were attributing some sort of chaotic dimension to that, were actually meaning what the ideology of the so-called, say, the Dark Ages was meant in an anti-traditional way, right? This is not how humanists believed that crisis to mean, right? It is today's people who actually have been indoctrinated in mocking the past because, of course, there the standards of actual people existed. And, of course, what we live today is just, again, an abortion, an unworthily human abortion of mankind. And we have this bizarre idea of the Middle Ages. I mean, just look at YouTube, right? There are entire medieval history channels dedicated to a sort of creepy... what were the greatest means of torture? Which were the most satanic popes? Like this kind of ideas, right? It's very difficult to make a modern person understand, especially after the Reformation. But this is not just about the problem of, of confession. This is properly about the way your brain was molded as you were growing up, right? This is a severe problem. We have been cultivated, at least in an incredibly poor way, in the last traces and remnants of traditional awareness, and it's extremely difficult to go back to that, primarily because of this lack of knowledge, and of course that's how most people look at the Middle Ages. But this is alone explaining you a lot what is that was actually moving people in the late Middle Ages, in the early modern age, to look back at the classics, right? Before the germ of anti-religion, of anti-tradition, and anti-merit, and anti-value, right, emerged in the later modern era, because of the rise of the unworthy rise on the wake of the actual elite that was moving the entire system of again, the third and the fourth estate. This is why we're looking back at the manuscripts. This is why we're looking back at the classical world, right? Because they had pretty clear traditionally what that was about, right? Instead, our vision, common culture is These guys, I don't know, just like the Greeks and the Romans, because yeah, I mean, there was some maybe continuity with traditional ideas, but basically we have made of the Greeks and the Romans some strange republican democratic peoples that they never were, notoriously. Should be attracted to the aestheticistic, contemplativistic side of the story, and that's how Roman and Greek history is told today. Oh, look at this fresco, or look at this, how the Romans ate and whatever. And the entire concept of the imperial Catholic tradition is completely taken out of the way. Of course, the late medieval and early modern regimes were instead rigidly and traumatically as patriarchal and virile and hierarchical as those ancient systems. The greatest myth that you also been fed is that the Renaissance corresponded to some sort of elevation of individual liberty. This was the literal moment in which it was sinking. We're talking the tripudium of the ancien regime after the late medieval crisis, right? So it's as if every single thing you were told from a lay perspective was completely flipped, right? I mean, I'm not kidding, and you perfectly know that I take my time at length to explain this, right? So the sense among this is that positivism, determinism, materialism, technologism, etc., brought some imbecile in our times to come up with the idea that in order to, recreate, and nobody really has explained it to that extent either, right? Some sort of centralized power, for example, like power concentration was greater, of course, in classical civilization, and in early modern times we see definitely that compaction as well. There would have needed to just it would have just needed to take place an imitation, if not a copy, right, a re-edition, right, of the ancient also military. What exactly? The armies were not the same, right? The Renaissance warfare had definitely surpassed in power, in order, and actual means what the ancients could put together overall, and at least this was happening to a degree that you can't quite equivocate. Also, 13th, 14th century armies were really in Western Europe something really impressive, right, and particularly advanced, and this had happened. Surely, again, the awareness of classical knowledge was there, right? But I'll explain a little bit better why, when you study eventually military history from the actual sources of the time, and you sort of let that sink in and understand more for years, like how these guys reason, etc. Of course, there's no trace of any evidence of a relevant copy of the past, just per se. The Swiss Pike Square had nothing to do conceptually with Macedonian phalangites, right? Those were different military systems that worked with different arms combinations. They had different backgrounds, different trainings, different also arms and armor. But the sense that the modernity would have sort of broke. This is a typically modernistic myth. Remember, the modern era, I use it for the sake of didactic, let's say, but never existed. Right? If we were to study in a serious scientific and moral sense what we can spot as military systems, definitely the Middle Ages lasts until, again, the 18th to the 20th century. There is no doubt. In terms of social extraction, of values, of properly the way that the armies were brought together, that's the end. Right? There was no modern age. There's just the ancient, the medieval, that did exist as such, even though we gave it this ugly name of the middle thing, and contemporary. Right, the modern era does not exist. An entire branch of historiography has been basically and artificially designed exclusively to pretend that there was this era that sort of punched in the face tradition, all traditionally held beliefs, and so that we came out of whichever darkness, even though the Renaissance was obviously a medieval product, like modern Europe, as we call it, is the product of medieval development, and it was in many ways also less developed than some peaks of medieval civilization, right, to be honest. But, of course, this depends on what you see, but we're not going to digress on this specifically today. But the sense again is that, oh look, they started writing treatises that, by the way, were the product of some, in fact, rigid elite culture of some sort, not really, and they were in this sense much more abstract, right? It's in this sense, and relatively much more impressive what, I don't know, a 13th century, 14th century, 30,000 men strong army could boast, in terms even to a 16th century one. Don't think that those were actually that more advanced than the ones of a couple of centuries before the late medieval crisis, but before they didn't have treatises. They did read Vegetius, but they knew how to make things work, even without theorizing. And as we have seen in the von Clausewitz series, actually this theorizing, up until the 18th century, it's something I discussed recently, talking discipline in fact, the age of so-called Enlightenment, was very timid, was very imperfect. Nobody really in this time, this, say, 16th, 17th, 18th century, was literally thinking that what they were writing, first of all, belonged to a standardized canon whatsoever that we should interpret in a uniform way, scientifically or morally. But they would actually fight in different ways, even against their own precepts, right? Given certain circumstances. This is basically the difference between people who understand what von Clausewitz is and those who think that literally if you read Sun Tzu you get any strategic education. The latter group literally doesn't have an idea that Sun Tzu has practically nothing to do with that, nor it's actually useful in any applicable way in fact, scientifically and morally theorizable fashion. Right? It's like comparing work at the time of Pythagoras with the one of the times of Hegel, right? And literally, if you do not understand the difference, that's a problem in your education. There's sort of black hole there, but again, if you don't see it, it can be a problem. But since so many people, in fact, normally don't see it, of course, they could buy the idea that even sort of recent scholars like Keith Roberts, for example, believe that there was this sort of important, incisive contribution brought by the rediscovery of the classics on the development of the early modern art of war. All right. Now, this is an introductory video. You understand that the topic I just touched on, it could be discussed in tens of ones, starting from, for example, how do we know that, right? How did these scholars found, for example, their ideas? Those are very easy to debunk. But also, how do we know the contrary? The contrary wasn't true. That is to say, even a medieval commander reading Vegetius, how do we know that he wasn't thinking about actually applying Vegetius norms? And how did he understood that? What was his sort of attitude towards it? Most of this is undocumented, but there is the way of the historian of the art of war, which is the guy who studies campaign after campaign after campaign, with battles from all sources available, and that looks at a period and says, you know what, that hint to the fact that, I don't know, this prince had that book in his library probably has nothing to do with the kind of information we get about this formation. If that information, for example, is that common or somehow normal in the broader literary landscape by people that didn't read Vegetius and or weren't probably even interested in their work and pointed at sources of that kind, and this gets it's practically understood just when you really study battle after battle and you realize what kind of mentality was there primarily behind that, and how more or less people at a given time were trying to explain the posterity, what happened through, you can see much bigger deal of a reason behind that than trying to mimic like an ancient author's notion, right? And this is true even for sources that are very classicistic in tone and pre-humanistic, and that remarkably, even though they use a lexicon that is obviously drawn from Livy, from Virgil, whatever, because it doesn't have just to be military treatises, just classical works talking war, that definitely. In fact, of a common topic to discuss historically, right? Also, pop culture today has made you believe that fundamentally history is about lots of things. War is just not a strange thing. Let's not talk about that because it's bad. It's violence. You don't want. Actually, history is talked mostly about war. And it's also pretty obvious, not just because at the time, of course, warfare was sort of much more pervasive in relative terms than we see, that it's the case today, and even up to, just from just a couple of generations, not really that far away, but also because objectively, it's given the importance of the political action in itself and the consequences of war and the instability of the systems of the time. Of course, it was a big enough deal to deal with that to some extensive observation that surely didn't lack among the contemporaries of the time. As people saw war and so understood very well, even when they were not fighters, for example, what the consequences of it were in this or that context. Right, and this is true also for the Renaissance, right? For the time in which this classical insight would have come to model even properly the way states went at war, how armies were arrayed or equipped or trained, whatever, right? Again, the primary role that, of course, figures like Alexander, Caesar, and again, also medieval commanders like, at least ideally, Charlemagne, etc., had meant for these cultures, and would continue to, was pointing at mostly great commanders in history that were backed by great civilizations in history, right? You can't quite see great commanders among tribesmen, because simply there is not such a level of societal development that allows even all the great, Hannibals that might have existed within the Germanic or Celtic tribes to actually prove themselves, because they didn't literally have the military means to get more than a certain distance away with them, right? And this is also very well explained by von Clausewitz. So in other words, it wasn't much about the war in itself, but what this meant mystically, what it meant morally, and what it meant politically. And this is what, we read at the end of the day these works for in the first place. We do get fixated with this stuff. I mean, imagine even today, in the how do kids today learn about warfare? They watch YouTube or TikTok or whatever. They see video games like the ones of the Total War series that we have also all grown with by also as late millennials, and sort of get interested in some way legitimately in Rome, in Macedon, in all these big deal of the Napoleonic era that of course here had yet to happen, but still, all these great models that surely represented something with the same meaning, that for the same reasons that these guys in the past were fundamentally countered by different degree, but fundamentally by the same idea. Now, does this mean that a guy that is extremely passionate about Roman warfare and Macedonian warfare, that incidentally maybe has become a high officer in the Ukrainian or in the Russian army, currently adopts, some sort of broader insights just from that in a way that effectively impacts the war in Ukraine strategically? Obviously not, right? There is a universal dynamism within war that is well exemplified by von Clausewitz, that incidentally is much more, of course, informing our military culture, even without most commanders actually, I mean, contemporary armies really having studied him or having known that, but also with many commanders that go allegedly through strategic studies that turn out to be mostly just training them in sort of replicating certain operational, tactical, strategic modules, but that completely skip the concept of forming properly a strategic culture in acumen through unavoidably, as von Clausewitz also explains, necessarily from a theoretical point of view, actual military history through sources, reconstructing campaigns and battles and whatever. Right? I've read what they read at West Point about the Battle of Gaugamela. It's like reading Mickey Mouse. Right? This is not to disqualify the military institution, but just be aware that problems are real in the sense that also in the past, as in every time, it's actually direct military experience that matters. And if you're not a military man, the only thing that remains to you to do is to, in the absence of an actual command, to study military history, because military history is the history of reality, right? It's not a war, an imaginary war, a fantasy war. It's the actual historical reality that happened at the time. So you're studying the most reliable thing ever. Of course, there are ways and ways of making military history, and you have to do it well, and we lack a lot of that, but it's absolutely not a myth. Many people are shocked when I say this, that military, so at least the good military historians, understand war better than the military. And I'm not kidding, right? It's universally notorious and a strategic field that even if you're a soldier that sacrifices himself in an assault to an entrenched position out of bravery and love of your fatherland, you will not even have understood necessarily why you were doing that, or understanding the politics behind that, or the strategy behind that, because you're just a soldier, right? So war can change you in so many different ways, and it can teach you a lot of things, and surely every veteran has a massive sort of military experience that contributes to the teachings when these are passed down, they're studied, etc., that are very important, but relevant, at least for the study of military history. But that alone has absolutely nothing to do with the theory of the art of war, per se, or being competent or proficient in it, right? So this concept does affect the sane historians, and especially the ones that are a bit the ones say, I teach in a military academy, so I know these things, right? We are the guys who study the thing. Yeah, well, if you there is plenty of videos on YouTube about these institutions, and some are interesting, etc. But it's just like guys giving a basic, high school lesson about a certain level about a certain military event that they studied in some depth. Of course, they have to be concise about, but that they make fundamentally just disclosure of, and just in the terminology, even in some other aspect, make you understand probably there's not much of a care for the historical accuracy in a broader, not just in talking as if history was just a bunch of information found somewhere, but how you explain that, how you politically, culturally, morally explain that, like how does that come together, and how does that make sense, right? These are the craft of the historian is very hidden, and the truth is that most historians are just lying to you because they want to act as if they were proper and accurate, but at the end of the day they're just feeding you some sort of mash that doesn't quite make a lot of sense, except most people do not know practically anything about, and so they can't sell it to you, and pretending that just because, for example, people accused me in the past, you do not cite sources, you do not follow bibliography, so you must be unreliable. Historical accuracy and historical reliability are two very different things. If you do not understand the concept, you're part of the problem. And that's why I'm also making Schwerpunkt because I am the only person who's talking on YouTube about this. As far as I'm aware of it, I spent decades watching YouTube and never found a single person that, not that must agree with me, but that just talks the things I talk about when it gets down to how do we understand military history. That doesn't enter the frame, the realm, the dimension of this kind of topics, because most people who do that, a few people are interested in history, and even less in military history. And so the few ones that you happen to see out there are just professional historians in public interviews, whatever, so they're not going to talk like I'm talking from my bedroom, right? And I am, of course, sort of more... I'm freer. That's why I like to be provocative and harsh and whatever, because I think it's the only way to deliver people something that really makes more sense and it can be more useful to them with their criticism. And it's hard. It's not easy. That's part of the reason why I don't get many views, etc., because I'm difficult, the way I speak, the way I explain things. It's not easy to follow. But if you sort of enter in tune with it, in synchrony with it, well, sort of rings some bells, and multiple people sort of proved me right in this. I mean, it worked with them, it resonated with them. And so this topic could open to so many different, say, branches we could examine it, hopefully will. This is not to say that classical authors did not have an influence in forming the Western modern strategic thought. Right, definitely there is an intelligentsia behind this that reflected on these works, studied them, not just from a military point of view. I mean, studying, Caesar is obviously just a matter of personal culture and necessity. You can't be a Westerner without having read the Commentario di Bello Gallico, nor hopefully doing it, by the way, from Latin, right? So there is much also about the actual military manuals of antiquity that are a bit sort of spoiled by certain perspective. I mean, if you read Vegetius, you're not reading something as qualitative as Caesar's history, right? Through Caesar's history, you can understand so much more, not just because obviously the guy was there, and he was actually pretty historically correct in the way he explained what was taking place, but it's in fact rendering you a history of it, right? As a narrative source, whereas a manual is a bit more complicated. It's something that especially was influenced. You see, the Romans were much more about moral force, right? And I notice how same Caesar's theology, for example, personal religion, revolt, that if you are not aware of, read it from Alta. I also made a video about that. Throughout, around the same principles that eventually would be summoned by von Clausewitz. And there is an interesting connection there regarding what is that makes strategic culture. The blend of modernity with tradition, for example. The Greeks instead were much more abstract in this. They were smarter, they were more intellectually developed, but in that sense they were also more detached from the practical side of the story. And so actually the most famous military treatises stem from that tradition that is also just per se detached from the actual art of war. And it really depends. There are masterpieces. I love Pseudo-Maurice's Strategicon, right, of the 6th century. That's really a peak of Byzantine civilization as far as that blend between Latin and Greek thinking, right, was sort of, in fact, balanced. But it's just what I was saying about Sun Tzu before. Right? You don't have to read those sources and thinking that by reading those simply you acquire ipso facto a strategic education or competence. Especially if you do not work with them, if you don't try to reconstruct how those peoples actually fought through the complete picture of sources that we actually do have if you really scratch beneath the surface. And so the idea that reading, let's say, how a phalanx worked in the 16th century, I mean, reading from the 16th century how a Macedonian phalanx worked in antiquity, would be something meaningful in the way pike and shot warfare developed. Right? One thing is appreciating the uniform discipline or equipment by some degree, just by the way, of the Romans, of the Greeks, etc. Another thing is actually thinking that a 16th century Spanish tercio actually works along the same pattern, or the Dutch army of the 80 Years' War of the Dutch Rebellion really were articulated or developing along that same model. Right. Also because we do not really have the proof that that was ever the case. Well, one of the earliest videos I made on Schwerpunkt was the one about the medieval battle formations from the sort of preparatory sketches in the Burgundian army of Charles the Bold. That was essentially already a humanistic context by commanders who did really study, read at least, they had impressive libraries containing most of these classics, and we're starting to elaborate their own sort of theory on war, more in fact in a written fashion that had evidently existed before conceptually, but had not been needed at the birth of sort of more complex armies at this point to be written down, and still being very far from any actual applicational advice. In concrete, right, doctrinal terms, which in fact would have been even anachronistic terminologically at that point. And of course, were impressively complex arrays, and that of course we know from eventually from the same battles that were conceived that they had nothing to do with how the Burgundian army deployed, which was exactly how normally armies deployed, like a couple of battle lines and with the same support interaction of the various arms. And that's it. The only difference is that when you find this written, it's obviously saying, aha, so, got it. This scholar told me that wasn't the case, wasn't true. So these guys had to be careful because, this was just theory, but it didn't match practice. Yes, but the thing that, that scholar should have told you had he studied, which he didn't, otherwise he would have added it, as a note, is that usually they say things like, this is the first time we actually get to find precise description of our race, but this is actually not true, right? First of all, if you study military history on a regular basis, you know that throughout the late Middle Ages, we kind of know how armies were arrayed on a regular basis, but almost virtually no historian studies, again, battle after battle, campaign after campaign, to simply realize after several of these instances that of course it was pretty much a general way in which these armies were deployed that mostly stuck also to simplicity as one of the classical principles of the art of war, and that were all pretty much similar, the same. The more I studied military history, the more I realized that after all the differences between armies were not that big, right? And that it's often our ignorance or laziness that brings us to think, oh my god, let's think about all the possible ways this could have been. When you actually get enough experience, you can basically tell how these armies were. And of course, nobody was really surprised about different armies at the time either. And all these sources, including medieval times, a bit like the Romans, telling what? Telling about the moral dimension of that battle. Not what kind of formation they used, or what kind of weapons they used. I made a video about the Battle of Poitiers that explains that beautifully. One of the most important battles of the 100 Years' War that people remember a bit like Crécy and Azincourt for the longbow, right? And in those sources, there's literally nothing that tells you that the longbow, of course, came even remotely close to make it, but nor that anyone would even think that. Because, of course, that was just light infantry. The most important thing were men-at-arms, and yes, combined arms, but there is no evidence whatsoever that Poitiers was won by the longbow. What is overwhelmingly evident is that, the Black Prince was a hell of a commander, and that he used certain strategic principles that are pretty universal, but that are difficult to use, exactly because the simplest things in war, after all, are the hardest, right? But that he managed to pull off anyway, and that's what makes the battle, and that makes you say, wow, that was a hell of an army. Longbowmen or crossbowmen, that doesn't actually matter, right? But no, we have to fixate with the technologistic determinism, because the fourth estaters have too small of a brain to actually understand anything slightly more complex than that. And so you can't sell books if you do not explain it like as if you were talking to someone who took a blow in the head as a child. So the actual, I'm rude, but it must be so, right? It's impossible for the 21st century, after all the achievements that after all we managed to pull off, that we are still in this miserable moral condition, right? And that does speak for the degeneration of the world. There are things that work, and they kept working because warfare was always a mess, but it sort of worked, it always does, at the level that it obliges you to, right? And not seeing this, it's like living with a veil in front of your eyes, with reality going on, but you having literally no idea and speculating without simply taking off that damn veil, right? So if we look at the shelves of an ideal military library in Europe in the, say, first half of the 17th century, the time of the 30 Years' War, we can definitely find many, even just influences. They don't have to be, strictly speaking, the classical works that would have been present, but actual works on those classical works, and which is fascinating. But already some scholars have noticed that the military treatises, both the ones of the art of war and the ones connected with a broader exercise of arms, were, and this is also true for fencing treatises, by the way, as all Himaists should know, but they don't, because, you know, great part of their business rests on the presumption that, you know, these works were more than what they actually were actually, again, an object of propaganda of some sort, than a real training manual or anything that would prepare you to actual warfare, right? And this becomes particularly true, and I made recently a video about this, the one about the firepower of the 30 Years' War. When we look at the same myth of a, you know, particular and positive, let's say, idea of progress, let's say, in the tactics of at least the main so-called innovators in the theory of the art of war, we're talking mostly, again, and we will see it in a video about the Dutch, you know, because this would eventually inspire also the Swedes later on, and I already explained a bit in that video what the deal really is, right? In other words, many of these treatises that were evidently inspired also to the ancients in many ideologically interesting historical ways. I mean, for example, if you hated Rome because in a classicistic sense you identified the papacy in Rome, as it did happen during the early modern era, you would see, for example, among the Protestants, a great interest towards Hannibal's tactics. Because if you have to defeat the Romans, hence the Catholics, you have to attack them like Hannibal. This is classicism, right? This is a bit like Anna Komnena in the 12th century was writing the Alexiad for her father, and she was calling the Western Franks the Celts. Why? Because, you know, if the Romans, the Greeks had called the guys who inhabited there the Celts, it was a fixed reality. Those guys are like that, and it can't change, right? It's a bit like today's nationalism, which is of course a socialistic, quasi-communistic ideology born among leftist terrorists of the Fourth Estate against European elite tradition, right, of the imperial Catholic unity, in just, again, in the later centuries, that wants, you know, people to, for example, to never change. This is a sort of weird hysteria, and the same swings are present in the same multiculturalism and communitarism. The two permeate each other, right? Both, that's what the extremes of what we call improperly a right-left wing. You see, they habituated you to think horizontally, as if the only options were those of the 19th, 20th century post-traditional societies. There is no actual vertical dimension there. You think that right and left are the same thing. What we actually see is just a bunch of nationalists and or socialists, because they are that, right? Just to a degree. Nationalism opens to socialism, socialism opens to communism in a straight line towards hell. And again, if you do not know this, you're part of the problem. You would have had a severe problem in talking even just with a person from the 17th century and pretending that they also gave a damn about you just because you were part of an alleged nation. That's not how they reasoned. They reasoned on the value of the individual, which is the thought that, of course, generates total hysteria among anyone who thinks that is special only without any merit except where they were born. Doesn't matter if they had disgusting parents, they had no education, they are failure of people, they do not earn anything. But they will be cool because they have that, nationality written on a passport, right? That's how the fourth estater weakness and inferiority rose. And that's why these ideas must spread, because without them, the fourth estater cannot afford to survive, right? At least mentally, before they sink anyway into the abyss of nothingness in eternity. But the point was exactly this. Let's pretend that, things work a bit like the way we would like to, even if we haven't begun to be able to theorize. And let's pretend that what we're doing is just we are inspiring ourselves to the Romans or to the Greeks or to whoever in this sense sort of seemed to be the most updated model that existed in the past, in the most glorious past, and that we must be like, because otherwise we are the losers of the situation. Does this have anything to do with how these peoples fought? No. Right? Again, the increase in uniformity, in training, collective discipline, all this stuff does exist. And it's obvious that would be an increased interest in classical works because people knew that the ancient armies were more disciplined, they had that degree of control, etc. So now, yes, civilization, there was some sort of comparison that seemed more obvious, but the actual connection there between fought war and what these same commanders could theorize wasn't the one that at least we believe it existed, because they knew better that it did not exist. It was propaganda, it was clever propaganda, but still propaganda. Right? I really don't see anything wrong with propaganda as such, right? People assume immediately, just like many other words, that propaganda, like discrimination or whatever, have inherently a negative bias. They don't. They're purely and beautifully neutral Latin words. They simply mean something that gets propagated. They must be propagated, right? It doesn't tell you anything about the content. It doesn't tell you whether it's a beautiful, correct, right thing. It must be propagated. Another thing that is that ineffective. Right, and that's because the fourth estater is also paranoid and cannot sort out information by himself. You see how everything falls into place. But again, in the age of fourth estaters, scholars had to think about that, right? Because they sort of course, began to also throw away the idea that you must be learned in moral values, that you must be able to evaluate spiritually things. And of course, you cannot quantify them, you cannot count them, right? And this also makes the fourth estater hysterical, and that's why contemporary science is purely materialistic at the end of the day, aside from what they think, of course, matter is. And I have nothing against science in that sense, except there is another dimension, especially the one of application, must take in consideration things like life, conscience, existence, that you will not find out in a laboratory. Because just mathematics tells us that cannot be done, at least in that way, because you know how limited you are. Maths already sorted that out, right? There is of course, there is need of constant improvement, also in a material sense, scientifically, in research, etc. But crossing that moral dimension out just because you cannot count it, because you declare to be incapable of doing so, is rejecting the entire notion of politics and warfare. Because as von Clausewitz explains, and how some decades spent studying the art of war macroscopically and self-evidently shows, war is a struggle between moral forces. And if you're not able to evaluate moral forces because you're there with a centimeter or a calculator thinking to have a number, something that you must rely to because, you think that that's more important than yourself, otherwise you can't do anything. It means that you cannot understand warfare as much as you cannot understand the actualization of the self, right? And that's why military history came up with, after von Clausewitz, you had charlatans like Little Hart and lesser people actually believing that that was an actual thing. Culturalism, pure idiocy, made, I don't even want to call it military historical theory because, that's definitely not military history. It's just, a divertissement for the lesser intelligent. But what can you do about that? Everybody has fun the way they can. So when you read more carefully the military texts, for example, of the Imperial Roman era, or specifically when you realize that in fact we do not know anything about how the Romans actually fought, because first of all, nor the narrative sources, nor these actual manuals tell you, right? And if you do not acknowledge this, like I presume you wake up in the morning, if you have any military historical interest, knowing perfectly well that we do not know practically anything about how the Roman legion fought, right? But many people think that we do, because they still have to read the works, they still have to study the bibliography, and so they are convinced that there is some sort of exoteric knowledge that will allow them to eventually get exactly how, the damned maniples were spaced or between one another or whatever. We do not know universally. Like, if you know the ABC of Roman military history, it's universally unknown and unknowable information. There are theories that are all better, maybe one better than the other, or worse than the other, but they are just speculative. And we do not have that information. There is no way to carve it out. Right? This is not a limit. It is a limit of ours, but it's intrinsic in our museological tools, right? It's not something that the genius can find out from some alchemic combination. For the exact aforementioned reason, also primarily moral forces, right? The Romans did actually write more military treatises than the ones we have. There are some Latin works from the 1st to the 3rd century AD, and that we know of, but that did not survive, right? And there are references to some specialistic works that would have been written by Celsus, by Frontinus, and even more importantly, and this is what really makes you want to cry till the end of time, certain regulations issued by Augustus, Trajan, and Hadrian that today are lost, right? They result lost. We never lose hope, but let's be honest, like what we have found so far, unless in some kind of hidden, manuscript under some lava sort of stratum in Pompeii or whatever, it's unlikely, right, that we will have anything of that kind. But we do know they did write them. And of course, if we had read them, probably, it would have blown our mind, given the historical relevance, but probably we would have not found the information that we would have liked in our, most golden dreams to have had. And the same Vegetius, again, that remains basically the only military treatise that the Westerners read during the Middle Ages, was writing notoriously from the 5th century. His treatise, the Epitome de Re Militari, it's actually the only one in Latin as a type of work. And he had, the interesting thing, he admits notoriously that he didn't know much about military stuff, right? But he said that he did actually access those documents, and probably many others that we don't even know of, but that he did. And he, in fact, laments himself in these terms. He says that the historians and the books that were handed down to us are the events and the deeds of the wars, while they sort of skip those topics that are about our research, the Vegetsis research, as if they were already known. And Vegetsis, in this sense, is writing in Latin, but he has definitely already sort of Byzantine mentality, because that's where the Greek the Hellenic thought wanted to know a bit more about the theory of the geometry, of the arrays, of the formulas, of the thing. And I would say that, after all, it's better the way it is, because, again, concentrate those events and deeds of war that Vegetsis says, they're cool, but we would have liked to know more, actually by themselves reveal to you a world that a dry manual, right, telling you how far away were the legionaries' space. We have just Vegetsis and Polybius telling us, and basically the former says it was like almost like a phalanx order, and Polybius almost like an open order. Of course, the Romans would have used different orders depending on the situation, but here we're talking about legionary infantry, so the heavy one. And that's literally, in the entire Roman military history, the only information we have about how spaced were the soldiers among one another, and were Polybius and Vegetsis even reliable? And universally, the answer is we do not have the palest idea regarding, we have an idea about the reliability, but whether they were reliable about the specific datum, and they were sort of inserting it in their own work next to others, is a lot of stuff, right? It's not something, again, that you have an answer for, nor you're supposed to, nor to be searching for, if you actually care about the military history of it. But, as you know, I am a great supporter of narrative sources, because in my research, and especially about tactics, that's actually the most important kind. If you really want to know how battles were fought and you want to get to the core of the information, because also how much soldiers are spaced actually is irrelevant compared to, not just how the battle lines were spaced, but how the battle lines interacted into battle. And unfortunately, we know very few about the imperial era as well. This is paradoxical. We know a bit more about the Republican legion than the early Roman one. It's a bit like the classical Greece. We know more about the Euclidic classical phalanx than we know about the Macedonian phalanx, even though the latter system was more advanced and more recent. And there are all reasons for this, and I have my Hellenic and Hellenistic warfare playlist, so you can check out, aside from the Roman history one and the ancient warfare one in general. There are things that never change to some extent, but again, you need von Clausewitz to arrive to the point that you can visualize that, and it doesn't seem to you to be practical, at least as far as this fixed data that you want to find, but that's exactly the point, right? And again, I have, I think, more than 140 episodes on von Clausewitz uploaded. You can check that out. I'm not going to digress on the concept. You know, or you should know what I mean. So the clear impression that we derive from this is that besides the fact that effectively a few survived, also a few had been written, because also ancient warfare, even in the times of the Romans or Alexander, did not require that. It's the same reason why the medievals didn't write this kind of manuals. Warfare was just, as always, done. And yes, there were manuals at the time, there was some knowledge, there were some thoughts and debates, whatever, but the possibility of actually creating a military theory that would be applied as a sort of support to the general in battle, like a manual that the commander can fall back to in cases of knowing at least the basics of what normally happens in this situation. It's something that you do not get until von Clausewitz, and that even to this point, in spite of his impact on military thinking, Western military thinking, and world military thinking as a consequence, has not really been fully digested, understood, and simply because von Clausewitz is not really studied as it should be studied, in the way he tells you that you should study military history, especially, which is, of course, let's skip that part. Let's just pretend like that we have read the thing, but of course, not even that we have studied it. Right? Keegan, for example, has clearly not even read von Clausewitz. It's self-evident from the way he completely misses the entire point. And this is laziness and weakness and spoiled, softness that doesn't have anything but what's the precision of this discipline, the accuracy at least, what you can really derive also in a practical sense through the historical evidence show. Military treatise, in a modern sense, is in order to be defined like something like the defense of a besieged cities by Aeneas Tacticus. Right, this existed in Greece notoriously already in the 4th century BC. It developed because, as I explained, especially in that video about the Deconstructing, there was a lot going on in poliorcetics at the time, and siege warfare was becoming more important. Siege, also artillery was coming around. In fact, in that primitive fashion, at least as torsion catapults, stone throwing, bolts throwing engines, and so the Greeks, again, that were fascinated with this idea of living essentially in a crystal perfect world of their own Greekness, thought that, okay, let's explain how, of course, this is still in becoming, but it is in becoming because we are becoming something within our own system, and so let's just exemplify mostly what happens, and let's not be too barbaric about the way this stuff eventually it does really work, and not how it should work or should be thought of in principle, right? And consider this, that in Latin there is not a word equivalent to strategy. The Greeks had them. The Greeks also had the treatise of Aeneas Tacticus, but guess who took over Greece and conquered the entire world, right? So one thing is what you write, one thing is what you fight, like, right? So the Romans knew strategy very well without even having a word for it, right? And it would be interesting actually to talk about strategy, because of course the way the Romans or the Greeks or the Mongols or whatever thought of war in this, what we call the strategic dimension, is naturally different from the way we do as well, mostly because they had the smaller scale of warfare than our own as well. Like, our own is more complex. Also, military theorists starting from Clausewitz had to address this in the age of mass society, etc. So this has nothing to do, and von Clausewitz's work is quite relevant in this, with the alleged idea that war changes, meaning that it's not the same war we fought, meaning that war intrinsically works in a different way in our time than in the past. No, war is truly always the same, but it's always declining in a different way. It's a very different concept, a double-threaded one, and of course, in that sense, the Romans had a hell of a strategic intelligence, like basically any other people who would come to that level of development or capacity. This is also, of course, cultural, political, moral. There's a reason why the Romans created the Roman Empire and other peoples didn't in the same ways. But of course, they knew what strategy was, and they knew how to use it, right? Even if they hadn't rationalized it or conceptualized it or theorized it or written it down, still we know that pretty much everyone knew how to think strategically, right? So that's why also this is a human thing, right? And that's why it's inherent. Warfare is always the same, because if you change the way people think, still this will influence your strategy, but reality is still the same, right? So we'll make it better or worse depending on the situation. And it's not just the infinite realm of possibility that, in this sense, will simply make you go wherever you want, right? This is important when you study military history. So, aside from this, going back to our point, it's difficult that within the span of the following 8 centuries, up to, I'm talking from Aeneas Tacticus, so from the 4th century BC to up to the the 4th century AD, so the time of Vegetius, no trace of similar works would have been written or adopted with the aim of some sort of, at least, instruction manual. Right? Vegetius was complaining for something pretty obvious, that is, we do not have, for example, a palest idea of what centurions technically did. Right? We have an idea of what they did, but not how. Right? Why? Because, of course, the Romans, who did write those few treatises at the time? The elite, or they were written for the elite. And as we've seen in our video about the early Roman, the early Imperial Roman army chain of command, these were the guys in charge first of all in Rome. There wasn't really any other commanding, and when they came to command as officers, they already had at their disposal troops that already knew what to do, with professional NCOs, and again, hundreds of years of a well-oiled military machine. And so they didn't care to write about those. They cared to write just about their military leads and what they were doing in the provinces or outside of them in major battles or wars. That's it. What the centurions did was not written down, because the centurions did not write at large, or didn't need to, practically. And just in the spirit of times, again, as I was saying before, it's not that armies were dramatically different from one another. It may seem to us that, a Roman army was particularly different from a Germanic army of the time, but they're practically the same if you compare it to just the imbalances that start occurring from the modern age onwards when you look at Western military superiority over the rest of the world. And also the complexity of today's warfare. Like today, more or less, we live in a civilized world by essentially Western imitation. And yet, of course, this world is so big and complex. There are massive systemic divides between armed forces that, say, in the ancient world did not quite exist. They were massive in relation to the times, to the crop rates, to all this stuff, but these armies looked all pretty identical. That what NCOs did in, the Macedonian army or the Roman army were substantially the same, right? What, Germanic infantries were like at the time were not conceptually or essentially different from the same Roman ones, right? So there are important differences, but pretty much all the war worked in the same way. And so people said, but the war is like this. It's been more or less always similar to this. They didn't have much of an idea, especially of how much the world could change from after 1 millennium or so. And so they didn't see even any problem. Like, warfare has always been fought like this. It will always be fought like this, and we always fight. There are always wars. So who cares about that? Everybody really knows, right? It's how people bake bread. Like, what's the interest in that? I really don't understand it as a historian when people tell me, I want to know the everyday life of the common person. Who the fuck cares about that? Let's be honest. Right, it's much more interesting to study the big works, the big ideas, because in a way or another they would have arrived down to the lower classes anyway, and still they tell you about the temper of the time. It's basically the best expression of the same. And it's not to say that literally everyday life has no meaning or no relevance. Of course it's interesting. Of course we would pay an enormous lot to know that, but because it would add up to something that at least we missed historically, and that would be the main relevance, but then everybody would sort of get bored with it, or at least it wouldn't be such a big deal. Instead, these topics, just conceptually, are much more relevant to understand, in fact, paradoxically, even how everyday life was at the time, which is what, is unpopular to say, but that actually is from a historical point of view. So today we have just these works that are also very antiquarian and learned in style, so also pretty detached and sort of, in fact, Hellenic-minded. We talk, for example, about the Techne Tacticae of Arrian, that in the 2nd century AD described the Macedonian phalanx of half of a millennium before. right? This is interesting. Well, he talks also about how the Roman army had to be arrayed against the Sarmatians, but it's so specific that you understand that, first of all, we do not fully get how the system worked. We can't think that it was literally arrayed in that way, or that it could always be. And so this starts looking suspiciously close, in fact, to the sort of a Hellenistic mentality eventually the Byzantines re-exasperate later on. Like, how did Byzantine armies fight? Like, we have to explain that by quoting some authority in the past and making it sounding similar to it, because that's how the order was in the time of Rome, of the greater, say, they thought to be Romans, but, of the better times, and so it must be. Right, look at Leo the Wise. We make multiple videos about early high medieval warfare, the enemies of the Byzantines. Leo the Wise basically copies entirely the Strategicon. It just adds some little note about this or that people that looked slightly different maybe from one of the early ones, and calls them also pretty much in the same way. And that was his work, repeating. Out of authority, not because he actually cared or probably knew how actual warfare was going on in technical terms at the time. So it's really, there are some things also written that tell you immediately that these guys had no actual, not in this case Arian, but in general, at least the purpose of the work was not really to describe accurately what real warfare really was, nor to express much higher, deeper thoughts because they simply lived them. And so these works were some sort of exercise or instruction for someone who could be inspired by them, but that would have not even spoken to the actual author, nor he would have spoken back in those terms, like to understand what he actually meant of how these troops had to be deployed. There is the Strategikos of Onasander. These are all in Greek, as you understand. That is dedicated to the duties of generals and emperors. It's very a didactic work, anecdotes. Like, again, Sun Tzu is pretty much the same. It's not that one concept may not be right, but it's not the structure that is meant to comprehensively understand that for good. It's just like, again, Sun Tzu says, never besiege a city. Why? Because in his time, the Chinese armies were full of chariots, and so it was complicated to sort of logistically remain there around a city. Would have bogged them down, whatever. But does it mean that you should never besiege a city? It's nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any strategical relevance whatsoever. It's not a principle that you can adopt in war, because it's not meant to. Right, but people today very often fall into this trap. So, on the base of this normal, by the way, lack of theoretical supports and specific documentation, again, is absolutely obvious. Right, it is true, as we just said, that it's that there were works and that went lost together with other, literary evidence. But we can conclude, obviously enough, that classical strategic culture was rather practical, was based on tradition, on custom. It was conservative in some kind, it unavoidably so, because the world wasn't really changing that much, and so also this sort of eventual sclerotization, repetition of the same, was actually the product of a social stagnation, of stratification, crystallization, especially again towards the Hellenic area, the Byzantine world. And if you know the history of these cultures, it's sort of obvious, right? So also the idea of limiting to the minimum indispensable, the theoretical aspect, and to leave the rest of the practical instruction to the instruction to practical life and the sense of opportunity, it's all sort of obvious. Again, none of these guys were literally thinking that you had to read their work and literally you would win a battle because of that. Right? It could be a take on it, a view of what should be done, or maybe it could be useful, but none ever wrote this to say, okay, if you don't do exactly what I said, you will always lose. The only way to win is this one. Right? It doesn't work like this. And from here, also the enormous value attributed to experience and to the capacity of the commanders, of highly professional ones, for example, like centurions, was born. Right, so the value of these NCOs was recognized. But actually, centurions, the first spears, they were properly officers, right? But the divide could be still at a social level so relevant that, again, we don't know too much about them. And it's obvious through, for example, the disproportionate centurion pay that you can immediately understand how much of a hell of soldiers these were and why they were chosen to command the troops, because they really knew their deal, and it was something learned the harsh way within the same army. That was also something standing, permanent. That also made an important difference, aside from the fact that armies are sort of course, always different. Don't think that Roman armies, even within the same period, were basically the same. They were basically the same thing, but they were identical, right? Or didn't have a specific bias or specialty or whatever. There was always some sort of organic floating, different troops they also were integrated with, and so on. So it always differed. Right, and essentially, that not even that the Romans, as we were saying before, were fighting in a particularly different way from other sedentary peoples at the time. Right, in Mediterranean, in Europe, basically, again, everybody fought with heavy infantry and cavalry support, some missile. That's it. Right, the Roman legionary evolves from the most basic concept of Iron Age warrior that you can find. There's nothing inherently specific. It's actually the Greeks that changed that a little bit, and in fact remain also confined within their reality and succumb to the actually more practically useful, right? But that's also a concept that deserves a bit more of attention. I will perhaps make some video about that. I did make the D video, like the usual Manipular Legion versus Macedonian phalanx, that stuff, from the actual battle accounts, which I think is very interesting. It's not just one example here and there. It's like literally, I made that video out of a little thesis that I wrote back in, I think it was during the master, or what, I don't remember. But because I really wanted to know that, and I discovered that after all, things were pretty balanced, even as far as that was concerned. It's not the weapons, it's something else. When you look at early modern warfare during the 16th, the 17th century, realize that the veteran commanders who had, of course, seen with their own eyes the reality of war in the battlefield were pretty aware of the same concept, right? And of course, as any veteran commander, they would participate to the debate that existed, of course, on how to improve the command of the man in combat. Right? So this was happening in the same way of the past, without too many pretenses. Right? There were some sort of complaints, some sort of takes, some opinions, some broader insight, intuition, but none of them actually thought that their work would have been inescapably adhered to, because they didn't even begin to write in order to comprehend the entirety of warfare and the factors involved in that. That's why we start the contemporary eye began to see this more practical advice, very often by, again, people who didn't have much other ambition, to see, okay, well, that's the ultimate aspect, but how you hold the pike or how you reload the musket, this kind of stuff. Well, those were just simple things that it could make circulating among the troops to say, okay, bear in mind how you have to reload the musket, but how that the pike and shot formation would actually fight on the battlefield or wherever, that was something they had to take in control themselves. And yes, they could write about that too. I could talk about the array, whatever, but in many ways there was something, as we've seen with the Burgundian battle plan, sort of a divertissement, right? That was their lifestyle, their profession. They like to talk about it. They like to write about it. They like to come up with ideas. Like, think about the double-armed man at the time of Charles I. So, like, on the eve of the English Civil War, there were people who legitimately thought that the longbow was superior as a weapon to other weapons. And of course, this person was wrong, and longbow didn't have any relevant part in the English Civil War tactics. Made some videos about that, by the way. At least they went at war at the beginning with that, immediately realized it was useless. Basically, that's how the story went. And that is also meaningful, because what you see on the battlefield at the end of the day, through those sources that allow you to reconstruct it, that is to say, what actually happened in that particular battle, is in many ways much more important than what these guys were sort of just theorizing. And it seems, I think, pretty peaceful about that. There were different regulations, there were different efforts to modernize, to improve, again, mostly to uniform. Like, I use the term modernize in this profane way by saying, what we conventionally mean by that, to uniform, to train more intensively from a collective point of view, etc. Because that's how you increase the effectiveness overall. Alright. And this proceeded also in a way that was not really just dictated by the treatises. This just reflected what kind of debates existed at the time. But of course, armies evolved by themselves. They don't wait for treatises to be written. Even by those whose authors are the same that command you. That's another thing we will point out now when talking about the Dutch army in another video. And the preferred texts were in fact quite simple in style as well. They were the ones rich in anecdotes, where military experience was diluted, also with a narration of the events, which was also useful in this sense. One of the most famous works were the commentaire of the Marshal of France Blaise de Montluc, 1500-1577, and this work was based on de Montluc's memoirs, or war memoirs fundamentally, and it was drafted according to the style of what does commentaire remind you, the commentary of Julius Caesar, that, as Montluc said, was the greatest of the captains that has ever lived, and he has showed me the way, writing himself his own commentaries, paying attention to describe during the night the actions during which he had taken part during the day. And it's not that Caesar literally tells us that, so you can see a bit of, see how much the Renaissance people loved traditional leaders, and how much they liked to make them feel like their own. Because, of course, if you read Caesar and with the eye of a military man, you understand that, of course, what he's saying makes sense. It's as if you could picture what he said, right? And so this would resonate among those who, with that engage in the same business, and that appreciated also how, the style, the approach, the simplicity, the mentality that this man had. It's as if the Renaissance man could understand that element of traditional, also dignity, that laid in these works, and that we have lost, because we want to know just the technical aspect. You see, this guy thinks that Caesar was just explaining to him like how to fight, which was not necessarily not really what Caesar had written the commentary for. It was a political reason for Rome describing accurately what the Gallic Wars actually were, despite of the best efforts of people who think that there is a huge conspiracy theory, right, against the Celts behind that. It's not Caesar's fault if the Gauls didn't, right? But also if they lost, right, entirely in 8 years remaining, half of a millennium under Rome afterwards. So there's no escape behind that. But as you know, I made lots of videos about Celtic warfare, and I have a huge admiration for Gallic warfare in particular. But again, it must be contextualized if you really love the Gauls, the Celts. Otherwise, it's just, again, as we were saying, it's communitarism. It doesn't make any sense. It's not real. It's not history. It's interchangeably multiculturalism and communitarism. Contemporary left wing and right wing overlapping without difference in the fourth estate. And the interesting aspect about de Montluc's work, by the way, is that even though he was one of the fiercest and say ruthless Catholic commanders during the wars of religion in France, we must force. I would like to make an entire series about the French wars of religions because nobody cares about them, but they were hyper cool. His work was appreciated also by his foes. For example, Henry IV of Bourbon, right? The first, the Protestant leader, then eventually converted to Catholicism. The father Louis XIII deemed Montluc's text as the soldier's Bible, which is also a very interesting thought. And this sort of had a moral meaning in it. Like it was about cultivating yourself through the history of the ancients, like you would spend time, like you would find meaning in meaning, in history, in values, in tradition. And that's what mattered. Not because Montluc's soldiers were fighting like the Roman legionnaires of the first century BC, right? Caesar is meta-historical there, and it must be because war is meta-historical itself. Again, check out that video about De Fortuna Caesaris, because that literally tells you what Caesar's religion actually was and how it was believed to be by his contemporaries in Rome at the time. So again, it's I could go on over and over, but the concept remains the same, right? It's not about what you would like things to be, but how they were. And history is never like only a shallow reading of history can make you think otherwise. That things must fit just your personal head, which is incredibly narrow compared to what the universe really is, and reality is, and history is. Right? Reason for which history actually helps you a great deal to grow as a person. Right? This is, in my opinion, the most relevant aspect of it all. I'd say we appreciate, because I want to make some videos about this topic as well, like what did early modern generals, for example, actually read, and how were they apparently thinking that, of course, the ancients could have an influence in the way they array their forces, but it's mostly not what they really meant themselves. And especially how the process of modernization of the armies, or at least what we call that in this way, was, of course, to be backed by some traditional meaning that would have, in fact, a political resonance, and that helped, in fact, bring into the idea that, of course, the armies coming out of the Middle Ages, at least the more also in some of the least developed areas, would have to reform themselves to be more effective, but surely not copying the armies of 1,000 years before or more. So For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.